Okay, wonderful. Well, so first off, thank you so much to Firas and Conrad for this invitation. I'm really honored to be a part of this amazing lecture series. And thank you so much to everyone who is here today. I'm really looking forward to your questions and your feedback and conversation after the talk. To begin, in the month of Muharram, the year 1078, so this is June or July of 1667, a young scholar in training named Muhammad ibn Umar ibn Abi Mahalli, who was living in the oasis city of Sijilmasa in what today is southeast Morocco, completed writing a text called Sharh al-Munabbiha, or Commentary on the Warning. The text is a commentary on a versified treatise of about 87 lines that Ibn Umar himself had composed. The warning is against what he calls corrupt behaviors and innovations, meaning things like the inappropriate mixing of men and women, eating and drinking to excess, and the indulgence of vices such as arrogance, backbiting, and envy. One undated copy of this text is found at a small family Sufi lodge in the Tuwet oasis of southern Algeria. This is manuscript Kusam 94, which you can see here. At the close of this text, we find an appended tract written by Ibn Umar. So he finishes the text and then he adds this other text directly afterward. And this is around 10 folios before getting cut off at the end. So we do not have the close. But this appended tract that he has added begins as follows. So he writes, this short text, so the text that he had written previously, came to be prior to the grave matter appearing to us, the matter in comparison to which all deviances and wrongs are like a drop in the sea or even less than that. This is the unbelief that appeared to us in Ramadan 1079 or February 1669 in most men among the people of the region. As for their women, the servants, the Bedouin, and the Berbers, their numbers are even greater. Had this appeared to us before this short text and other texts of mine, I would have warned about it from beginning to end, indeed on every page. I would not have preceded it with anything, for there is no act of disobedience above unbelief. So in Ibn Umar's other writings, he explains this grave matter of unbelief in detail. The problem, according to him, is that most people in his ostensibly Muslim community are so ignorant of even the most basic theological doctrine, like the oneness of God, the uniqueness of God, that they cannot be considered believers. As stated here, Ibn Umar considers this problem to be so serious that had he been aware of it earlier, he would not have spent his time warning people against these other problems. He says that right belief, or iman, is like a person's head, and all of the other ritual actions, prayer, fasting, going on pilgrimage, they're like the body. And the body, of course, is important, but it cannot survive without the head, right? So ensuring that people have right belief for him is the most crucial task of someone who is concerned with the well-being of their community. So Ibn Umar sets out to do just this, to help promote right belief among the people of Sijilmasa. He's joined in this effort by some companions and by a growing group of followers. And together they undertake a program of quizzing people, so like questioning them about their beliefs in order to determine who is a believer and who isn't. They discipline people who they consider to be ignorant by according them the status of non-monotheists, so that Muslims cannot marry people they consider to be ignorant, and they also cannot eat meat that they've butchered. And Ibn Umar and his companions offer lessons on the basics of theology in a way that is meant to be accessible to people beyond their scholarly circles. A number of senior scholars in Ibn Umar's time were very disturbed by this program. We have extant rebuttals of his claims and ideas by the renowned polymath Al-Hasan al-Yusi, also by another major scholar of the time named Abu Salim al-Ayashi, and also by a lesser known figure from Sijilmasa named Mubarak al-Anbari. So to be clear, these figures do not disagree that iman or belief is crucially important. They agree. Everyone agrees that iman is absolutely the most important thing, but they take issue with Ibn Umar's assertions about the severity and ubiquity of theological ignorance, as well as with some of the ways that he was trying to promote right belief in his community. Now, as it happens, these discussions were not new to 17th century Sijilmasa. Scholars around the Maghreb, and especially around Morocco, had been debating what they call the belief of the common folk, Iman al-Awam, for centuries. And all of this is the topic of my current book project. I keep playing around with the title, but titled something like Creed for the Common Folk, Ignorance and Orthodoxy in Early Modern Morocco. The book examines this controversy in 17th century Sijilmasa and contextualizes it, situates it as part of these centuries-long discussions. My argument, briefly, is that the discussions shed light on the functioning of orthodoxy in Muslim societies. Although other scholars in Islamic studies have argued for abandoning the term orthodoxy given the Christian baggage it can carry, I think we can productively view orthodoxy in broader, not just Christian terms, but broader terms, as any set of ideas that some group has gained the power to define and to control as the truth. So what the book shows is that orthodoxy, sort of this process of defining and controlling, was a matter of conscious reflection for Moroccan scholars. That is, they had quite a bit to say about the proper way that they, as elite educated men, ought to go about promoting, defining, controlling right belief in their communities. Specifically, I argue that we find two main approaches to managing orthodoxy when dealing with less educated Muslims. So some scholars like Ibn Omar, but also a number of Moroccan scholars before him, take what I call an interventionist approach. They asserted that theological ignorance was widespread and that the proper response was for educated men to intervene by taking a firm hand in steering people toward right belief. Anti-interventionist scholars, so like Al-Yusi, Al-Ayashi, Al-Anbari, but also scholars before them, insisted that most Muslims do have sound belief, sound iman, internally, even if they cannot externally articulate that belief very well. So major acts of intervention are therefore, in the eyes of anti-interventionists, they're unnecessary and often even harmful because they cause all this distress for people and they can expose people to more complex theological ideas than they can handle. In the book, I track these two main approaches, the interventionist and the anti-interventionist, in both the Sijilmasa controversy and earlier, and I look at 6 main themes showing how interventionists and anti-interventionists thought about belief. So what do they consider to be iman? How do they think about creed? How do they think about ignorance? And then what did they think comprised the proper approaches to disciplining people, questioning people, and teaching people? The book, therefore, is a work of intellectual history, right? I'm interested in the kinds of arguments that these scholars were making. But of course, the scholars were not making their arguments in a vacuum. And so chapter 1 on power, therefore sets a foundation for the rest of the book by laying out the events that took place in Sijilmasa and analyzing how Ibn Omar and his opponents sought to gain authority for their approaches by leveraging various mechanisms of power. And these efforts too might be thought of as a sort of contest for orthodoxy, or at least for dominance, right? For the power and authority to say, this is how we think about common people's beliefs, this is how we promote right belief in our community, and we don't do it that way. Among the mechanisms of power that they leveraged was the writing of texts. So in this presentation, I'll be focusing on that aspect of the controversy in Sijilmasa. That is, I'll be focused on the fact of the writing rather than getting into the details of the arguments in the texts. So I'm interested in questions like, who was writing? What did they write? For whom were they writing? And how did these writings circulate? So today, I'll begin by briefly setting the scene in Sijilmasa, so giving us a sense of geographically, politically, intellectually, what was going on. Then I'll turn to the activities and writings of Ibn Omar. That will sort of be the focus of the presentation. Then a little more briefly to the activities and writings of his critics. And I'll end very briefly with some gestures toward some of the broader circulation of these writings. And I guess just to say up front, it's been quite hard to theorize too much what's going on here with the manuscripts. Most of the texts lack copy dates or information about the copyist. So we don't know when they were copied. We don't know who was copying them. And it's frankly hard to even piece together exactly what happened in Sijilmasa and what exactly the timeline was. So putting together this presentation for today was a good chance for me to take fresh stock of this material. And I'm eager, at the end for your feedback and any thoughts you might have about these texts, these manuscripts, as well as the controversy. So turning to Sijilmasa. Sijilmasa today exists as only a scattered set of ruins abutting the city of Risani in southeast Morocco, as you can see in that center map here. And you have a visual of the ruins off to the side. The city fell into disrepair over the course of the 19th century. But prior to this downturn, the city had played an important role in regional dynamics for centuries, since its founding in the 8th century as part of the Muslim conquests. The city is situated in the southern part of the Tafilelt oasis, and you can see that in the close-up here. So this is the oasis. And it lies between two riverbeds, the Wadi Gharis to the west and the Wadi Ziz to the east. And both of these run from the Atlas Mountains up in the north into the Sahara Desert just to the south. So this location as a connection point between the desert and the mountains, and of course beyond the mountains, the Mediterranean Sea, meant that Sijilmasa long served as an important stop for trans-Saharan trade. As well as being a major site for trade, Sijilmasa was a hub of scholarship and learning. So for example, this is the city where the polymath Al-Hasan al-Yusi, who was from the Middle Atlas Mountains up to the north, his father sent him to Sijilmasa to pursue his schooling beyond an elementary level, right? So today we might think, oh, Sijilmasa, this is off in the middle of nowhere, right? But at the time, this is the place that if you were in the region, you would be sent to undertake an education. The educational system is one that will be familiar to those of us who study Islamic history. So study centered on teachers and texts more than institutions and formalized curricula. So students would participate in the study circles of individual teachers as they worked their way through texts that the teachers were experts in and which they then licensed their students to read and to teach. With that said, we should be careful not to downplay institutions and curricula. And an institution that was particularly important in Morocco during this time was the Sufi Lodge, or what is called in Morocco, Zawiya. At the head of a Sufi lodge is, of course, the lead sheikh, and these lodges were important centers, not just of spiritual practices, but also trade, political mediation, sometimes quite militant political activity, hospitality, and also scholarship and study. And a major zawiya at the time of Ibn Omar's Credo campaign, and one where we know he trained and studied, is the lodge of the Nasiriya Sufi order. This is also right at the desert's edge, just to the south of Sijilmasa. Beyond the bustle of trade and scholarship, Sijilmasa in the 17th century was also the site of some major political movements. So again, we might think it seems like the middle of nowhere, but it's really the site of a lot going on. One of these political movements was spearheaded by a figure who appears to be a family ancestor of Ibn Omar. This is someone named Ahmed ibn Abi Mahalli. In the first decade of the 17th century, Ibn Abi Mahalli proclaimed himself a messianic figure and launched an attack against the then fragmented Saadian dynasty. He was successful in briefly seizing his home city of Sijilmasa, as well as Marrakesh, which is off to the west, before being killed by Saadian forces in the year 1613. The other major political movement out of Sijilmasa at this time was the rise of the Alawite dynasty. And the Alawite dynasty, of course, is the dynasty that still rules over Morocco today. So the Alawites consolidated power in the decade or so just prior to the Credo campaign of Ibn Omar, so around the 1650s. The Alawite leader Moulay Rashid took control of Sijilmasa in the year 1069 or 1659. And among the family clans that seem to have benefited from this change in government was a family clan called the Awlad al-Qadi. And this is the family to which the messianic figure Ibn Abi Mahalli, as well as Ibn Omar, belonged. The family ran a Sufi lodge in Sijilmasa, And as indicated by the family name Awlad al-Qadi, they were known for producing judges or qadis. And indeed, Ibn Omar's paternal uncle, we will return to him in a moment, was appointed to a very significant judgeship sometime around the consolidation of the new Alawite government. Turning now to Ibn Omar, we know surprisingly and unfortunately little about him. So far as I can tell, he's not been included in any regional prosopographical work, so he does not appear in any tabaqat works of the region. And this means we have to piece together what we can from the text related to his controversial creedal campaign. From these, we learn that he was a young man at the time of the campaign. He describes himself as a scholar in training or as a student. Prior to this campaign, Ibn Omar had penned at least 2 texts. Both of these are didactic tracts for which he wrote a commentary. The first, Sharh al-Mufida, begins with discussions of creed, of theology, and then it turns to ritual practices. From his discussion of theology in this text, it's clear that Ibn Omar has been trained in the major texts of his day, right? There is some semblance of a sort of curriculum. And in particular, the writings of 2 thinkers from 15th century Tlemcen in Algeria, Muhammad bin Yusuf as-Sanusi and Ahmed ibn Zakri. And he's also studied some of the later commentaries on these texts. Ibn Omar's other composition from this early period is Sharh al-Munabbiha, which I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, and which consists in a discussion of behaviors and mental states that people ought to avoid. This text in particular indicates that Ibn Omar, already at this early stage, had not just a didactic bent, but also something of a moralizing bent, right? He's sort of interested, he seems to be like drawn toward telling people how to be good, moral Muslims. Now, the way that Ibn Omar himself tells the story, it was in Ramadan of 1079 or February of 1669 that he first became aware of the problem of creedal ignorance, right? People being very ignorant of creed. In several texts, he writes that the precipitating encounter was between some unnamed companions of his and an unnamed man. This man recited a prayer. Then he pronounced that the angel Gabriel had conveyed the prayer to humans through the Prophet Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, Ali, seeming to suggest that Ali had the same kind of revelation receiving status as Muhammad. And indeed, Ibn Omar's companions, they heard him say this and asked the man, "Is Ali a messenger? Hal Ali Rasul?" And the man said, "Yes." They then asked, "Who is your Lord?" Meaning, who's God? And the man responded, "Muhammad." Ibn Omar reports that he was horrified to hear about this degree of ignorance, people just not understanding who's the prophet, who's God, how does this work? And he and his companions began asking questions of other people. They claimed to find that ignorance of even very, very basic creedal doctrine was severely lacking among many of the folks that they questioned. So besides launching his program of questioning people, teaching them, disciplining the ignorant, Ibn Omar began writing texts on this topic. All of these writings are still in manuscript, held today at various manuscript libraries around Morocco and beyond. Ibn Omar's goal in writing them seems to have been to alert others to this grave problem of creedal ignorance. The texts are exhortative, written in a very insistent tone, urging his audience to pay attention to what he considers to be this huge problem. So to focus in on one of these texts, what seems to be the first text that Ibn Omar wrote is this 4-folio text that you can see here. We might think of it as a pamphlet. It's an untitled tract that seems to have been meant to be sent out to neighboring cities and regions. At one point, Ibn Omar writes that the year is 1079 or 1669 when he wrote this, meaning that he composed this tract sometime in the several months after that initial Ramadan encounter. The text is extant in only one copy. It's bound together and between 2 incomplete copies of his early auto commentaries, Sharh al-Mufida and Sharh al-Munabbiha, and they're held at the Great Mosque Library in Meknès, which is just to the west of Fez. As far as I can tell, the hand seems to be the same across the three manuscripts, which suggests either that Ibn Omar sent all three of these texts out together, or that a later scribe decided that it made sense to preserve this short tract, the sort of pamphlet, alongside these other two texts. So to get an idea of what the text is doing, after the Basmala, it begins as follows. Ibn Omar, so this is the very first line. Ibn Omar says, I wanted to inform any among our illustrious scholars, authorities, leaders, and others who come across this from each region, city and tribe, east and west, of a grave matter in our region of Sijilmasa. We heard about it and were surprised, so we investigated and indeed witnessed it. And then he goes on to describe what the problem is. And further on, Ibn Omar reiterates that he is writing for, quote, the illustrious scholars of his time, aiming to call their attention to the problem of creedal ignorance in the hopes that they will undertake actions of advising and guiding people in their communities. And this short text then proceeds to do several things. Ibn Omar quotes past scholars, especially the 15th century theologian as-Sanusi, he thinks these quotations are supporting his perspective on the problem of creedal ignorance and the idea that this degree of ignorance is basically equivalent to kufr, or unbelief. Ibn Omar also tells many very brief, not much detail anecdotes about his own encounters with this kind of ignorance and his efforts to rectify it. For example, he tells of people who seem to think that the Prophet Muhammad is not a prophet, but a saint, or who think that the Prophet's companions, the Sahaba, were themselves prophets, or who think that God is an earthly being, or that the stars are the daughters of God, and sort of on with these types of ideas. Ibn Omar describes this ignorance as being most common among women and Bedouin, but he also claims that it's widespread among students or mid-level scholars. So we get an idea from this text that there are people who are sufficiently educated that they've memorized or studied, for example, as-Sanusi's short creed, and that they've maybe even, undertaken teaching it to others, but that Ibn Omar thinks they don't really have a proper understanding of its ideas. But he's always discussing these people in the third person. So he's not talking to them directly. And this really solidifies the sense that the text is directed toward high-level scholars, right? He's not speaking to these mid-level scholars. Besides the anecdotes about people's ignorance, Ibn Omar mentions some of the activities that he and his companions had undertaken. They did not, for example, give any zakat, any charitable offerings that year, except to people whom they had examined on creed and whose knowledge they found satisfactory. And they also engaged in teaching. So Ibn Omar mentions, for example, that when he teaches women who are unrelated to him, who are not part of his family, he does that from behind a partition so that they have a sort of proper separation. A further point of discussion in the text is what and how to teach people. Ibn Omar runs through key fundamental points of doctrine, and it's quite standard doctrine reflecting his training in Ash'ari theology as it was then circulating in the region. So there's no sense that Ibn Omar is using this credo campaign to push unusual doctrinal claims, right? It's like pretty standard Ash'ari ideas. As for pedagogy, Ibn Omar urges his audience to teach people however they will understand it. And he really emphasizes simplifying and making things accessible. This accessibility should involve using uninflected Arabic, so al-Arabiyya malhun, so Arabic without all of its grammatical case endings. And it may also mean teaching people in the regional Tamazight dialect, which is called Tashohit. So here it's worth remembering that Morocco is, of course, not monolingual, and that non-Arabic speakers would have been even more numerous and prevalent in the 17th century than they are today, right? So Ibn Omar lives in a society where a lot of people don't speak Arabic. And so keeping in mind this multilingual environment, I think also helps us to pay attention to the fact that Ibn Omar is writing in Arabic, right? And it reminds us to not take that for granted. As studied by Nico van den Boogert, Scholars in southern Morocco during this time did also sometimes write in Teshahit, in using Arabic script. So we have manuscripts written using Arabic script, but in Teshahit. And many of these writings seem to have been of a similar genre, so didactic religious texts. So Ibn Omar's writing in Arabic might reflect his own linguistic limitations, right? Like, I think we should hold in mind it's possible that people could and were writing in Teshahit. Or it might be yet another indicator of the kind of text that Ibn Omar wanted to write and the kind of audience that he wanted to reach. That is, in writing about the alleged creedal ignorance of less educated Muslims and the need to teach them in simple, accessible fashion, he's also demonstrating to his elite, educated audience his own ability to speak their language, that of high register Arabic. Now, there's one further piece of this text that needs to be addressed. Early on in this short sort of pamphlet text, Ibn Omar mentions his uncle. So this is the uncle named Ibn Abdulaziz, who was appointed to a major judgeship in Sijilmasa, a position that gave him judicial overview not just of the city, but also the broader region. So it's sort of loosely indicated on the map, kind of from just near Marrakesh in the west to the Tuat oasis, which is down here, in what today is central Algeria. Ibn Omar writes that his uncle, the judge, had also been concerned with the problem of creedal ignorance. Indeed, he was so concerned that he ordered announcements about creedal ignorance to be made in the marketplace in both Arabic and in Tamazight. And Ibn Omar reproduces a version of this announcement in his text, right? Like, everyone come listen to me, here's this problem. So the announcement consists in warning people about the gravity, sort of the seriousness of not understanding creed, stating that severe ignorance is tantamount to unbelief, to kufr, and that the ritual actions of ignorant people are therefore invalid. It's like, you might pray, you might go on pilgrimage, you might fast, but if you don't know enough basics of creed, none of that counts. And that therefore these people should not be given any charitable offerings. Ibn Omar writes that his uncle matched these proclamations with actions, such as investigations into the city's butchers and ordering people to learn the basics of creed. This report about Ibn Omar's uncle is matched by another text from 8 years earlier. So it was written in 1071 or 1661. And this other text is a correspondence that took place between a local scholar in Sijilmasa, someone named Al-Gharisi, and the renowned polymath Al-Yusi. Al-Gharisi recorded the correspondence at the end of a copy that he had made of Al-Yusi's marginal notes on the long creed of As-Sanusi. So Al-Gharisi had copied out this text, this theological commentary, and then at the end we find this question that he had asked Al-Yusi and Al-Yusi's response to it. This manuscript is now held at the Nasiriya Lodge Library in Temgrut. So this is the major Sufi lodge just to the south of Sijilmasa. The correspondence consists in Al-Gharisi writing to Al-Yusi to ask about the permissibility of Ibn Abdulaziz's actions when he assumed the judgeship. Al-Gharisi describes these actions in terms similar to those of Ibn Omar, that the judge had made warning announcements about the seriousness of not knowing creed, and that he refused to grant court hearings to people deemed ignorant until they had learned the basic creedal doctrine. Now, the big question, which I have not yet been able to answer, is what the relation was between the uncle's creedal campaign and the nephew's. Ibn Abdulaziz, the judge, began his own activities at least 8 years before Ibn Omar discovered, quote unquote, the problem of people's ignorance. And it's not clear from the sources whether Ibn Abdulaziz remained in the judgeship all that time and whether he kept up with his efforts. One possibility is that he was made to stop them. So Al-Yusi, for example, when he responds to this question from Al-Gharisi about the judge's activities, Al-Yusi says, these actions are really excessive, and especially in their disciplinary component. So again, one possibility is perhaps Ibn Abdulaziz, the judge, was made to stop his efforts, and then maybe later he's working together with his nephew to pick them back up. or perhaps Ibn Omar is picking them up on his own and somehow hearkening back to his uncle. It's all rather mysterious and hard to figure out, and is kind of a strange silence, I think, in a lot of the texts that I have. But to return to Ibn Omar, he went on to write several more texts after this first short missive, this sort of pamphlet. In particular, there's a 2-folio, so a very short, versified tract that is urging people to pay attention to creedal ignorance. That's held at the Hassaniya Royal Library in Rabat. And there's also a 2-part prose treatise that he wrote, sort of medium length, that's doing the same thing. So same thing as this text. That's also held, I think we have 2 or 3 copies at the Hassaniya Library in Rabat, and also up at the Abdul Ghanun Library in Tangier, up north. And again, these texts consist in the same basic pieces as the one that I just discussed. Ibn Omar includes quotations from past scholars that support his concern with creedal ignorance. He includes anecdotes about his encounters with this ignorance, his efforts to rectify it, and he includes guidance around how to teach people. All of the texts are in high register Arabic. They're meant for other elite male scholars, and he's urging his audience to take seriously this problem and to help sort of solve it, to help rectify it in their communities. So he's trying to reach out to these fellow scholars, and some of them did indeed join Ibn Omar's program and his efforts, but others, the scholars who might call the anti-interventionists, were quite opposed to what he was doing. They saw his ideas and activities as unnecessary, misguided, and disruptive, and they tried to put a stop to them while also asserting the correctness of their own approach to the belief of the common folk. They used a variety of techniques to do this. So even though I think, sometimes we hear in Islamic studies, oh, there's no centralized religious authority like the Pope, there's like no mechanism for controlling what people are doing, but of course there are a variety of techniques and mechanisms that you can use to promote your ideas. So for example, Al-Yusi tells us in his text Al-Muhadarat, or the Discourses, that he met in person with the leader of the controversy, Ibn Omar, and he tried to persuade him to change his ways, right? Like that's one mechanism that you might use. You might use your own seniority to have a face-to-face meeting to try to persuade someone to change what they're doing. El-Yusi was unsuccessful with this. And eventually what happens is that the local Alawite governor, so this is the new government, the governor based in Sijilmasa, he ended up getting involved. So he convened a gathering for Ibn Omar and his opponents to confront each other. But again, unfortunately, when exactly this happened is not clear. Was it months into Ibn Omar's campaign? Was it years into the campaign? The text that talks about this does not make it clear. And the result of this gathering is also unclear. So it's just not, it's not obvious from the text, did Ibn Omar stop after this confrontation? Did it not? But regardless, I think what's important here is one of the mechanisms that comes into play is the local government getting involved. And of course, another sort of technique, another way to leverage power is to write texts. And this is something that Ibn Omar's critics also did. So in the Discourses in Al-Muhadarat, El-Yusi tells us that Ibn Omar had tried and failed to gain as an ally the head sheikh at the Nasiriyya Sufi Lodge in Temgrut, and that moreover, Ibn Omar had denounced this head sheikh, Ibn Nasir, when he refused to join or endorse Ibn Omar's efforts, and that in response, Ibn Omar wrote another sort of short pamphlet or short text. It's called a kerasa in the Arabic. So he writes this kerasa against Ibn Nasir. And in response, another young man and scholar in training named Abu al-Abbas Ahmed ibn Sayyid seemed to have written a counter critique, like another short text in response. But I have not found any sign that these writings have survived. So we have some evidence that there's this kind of back and forth taking place, but we don't have those texts extant, I don't think. As is indicated by that anecdote, Ibn Omar's writings were circulating, right? They were circulating in the community. His critics were aware of that, and they were engaging with his writings. So for example, the local Sijilmasan scholar Al-Anbari penned a point-by-point rebuttal of the two-part exhortative tract by Ibn Omar that I mentioned earlier. So Al-Anbari wrote this text in the year 1084 or 1673. This is more than 4 years after the start of Ibn Omar's campaign. And again, it's just not clear, was the campaign ongoing during that time? Why did he write it at that moment? It's not clear. This text is titled Al-Kashf al-Tabin fi anna ibarat Muhammad ibn Umar fi takfir akthar talabat asrihi wa ghayrihim khariqatun li ijma' al-muslimin. So revealing and clarifying that the discourse of Muhammad ibn Umar in alleging the unbelief of most of the students and others of his era contravenes the consensus of Muslims. Al-Anbari clearly had close access to Ibn Omar's text, since Al-Kashf consists in a series of quotations from Ibn Omar's writing, along with Al-Anbari's refutations. So he's almost setting it up as a kind of critical sharh, like here's the quotation and here's my commentary, but all of my commentary is a refutation. Although Al-Anbari does not say explicitly whom he attends as the audience for this text, it seems clear that he's writing for other educated men, and he's aiming to sort of mediate and shape their experience of encountering Ibn Omar's ideas to be sure they understand how wrong they are, right? Like, you might come across this text, but like, here's why you should know all these ideas are incorrect. This text seems to survive in 2 copies. Both of them are undated. One is held at the National Library and the other at the Alal al-Fasi Institute, both in Rabat. Ibn Omar's writings also circulated beyond Sijilmasa, even during the time of his credo campaign. So the senior scholar, Abu Salim al-Ayashi, he heard about the campaign probably from the Middle Atlas Mountains, and specifically from his family's Sufi lodge, which is at a locale that today is deep, deep, deep in the countryside north of Al-Rashidiyah. So you can see here, we're talking just north in the mountains from Sijilmasa. So it seems like that's probably where Ayashi was when the controversy was happening. And it seems that visitors to his family lodge were bringing word of what was going on in Sijilmasa. So people are arriving at the lodge and they're saying like, oh my gosh, you know, this big conflict is happening in Sijilmasa. And one visitor had with him a manuscript copy of the second part of Ibn Omar's 2-part exhortative treatise, which Al-Ayashi says he was able to look at, but only briefly. But between these stories that he was hearing about the conflict and being able to look at this text, Al-Ayashi was, quite disturbed by what he heard. He says he was initially very reluctant to get involved because he's not an eyewitness firsthand participant, but eventually at an unspecified date, he did write his own response to the conflict. And this is a very long text. In print, it is 2 volumes. And he titled it Al-Hukm bil-Adl wal-Insaf al-Rafi lil-Khilaf fima waqa bain ba'd fuqaha Sijilmasa min al-ikhtilaf fi takfir man naqarra bi wahdaniyat Allah wa jahla ba'd man lahu min al-awsaf. So, the judicious and fair judgment to end the disagreement among the jurists of Sijilmasa as regards alleging the unbelief of those who affirm the oneness of God, yet are ignorant of some of his attributes. There seem to be 3 extant manuscripts of this text. One is held at the Ayashiyah Sufi Lodge itself. It's not dated, but it might be in Al-Ayashi's own hand. Another copy is in the collection of Ketaniya manuscripts held at the National Library in Rabat. It looks like it might have been copied as recently as 1927, which is of course raises really interesting questions about why it might have been useful to copy it at that time. And there's another copy at the Hassaniya Royal Library in Rabat. So evidently, the goal of Al-Ayashi and Al-Anbari's text was to refute Ibn Omar's ideas and to diminish his influence. But they were not entirely successful. Earlier, I showed you this map of the manuscript libraries in Morocco where we find copies of Ibn Omar's writings. What I did not mention is that we in fact have many more copies of these writings in the region south of Morocco around West Africa, as you can see here. Some of these manuscripts are copies of Ibn Omar's two early texts, the ones before his creedal campaign. Yet at each of the sites marked here with the purple X, there is a library containing at least one copy of a creedal exhortative text, part of his creedal campaign. And at some of these X's, there are actually multiple libraries, and some of these libraries have multiple copies of these texts. And in fact, it's from these libraries that Ibn Omar's longest work of creedal exhortation has been preserved. So there's like a quite long text where he's doing his thing of saying creedal ignorance is bad, we should pay attention to this, here's some stories, here's how to teach people. So his longest text like that is not extant in Morocco, as far as I have been able to tell, but we do have copies of it in West Africa. Among these libraries is the 19th century collection of Omar Tall in Ségou, Mali, which is held now at the Bibliothèque Nationale of France. We have a lot of Ibn Omar's writings in this collection. There's also several libraries in Timbuktu that have copies of the text. These are accessible through the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library in Minnesota. There's also a loose collection of writings from the historical Senegambia, held now at the British Library, and also several small family zawaya in the Tuat oasis of central Algeria. We find text there. As with the manuscripts in Morocco, most all of these copies are undated and do not indicate the copyist or owner. So more work will need to be done to determine how it was that these texts circulated. One likely possibility is that they circulated through the network of the Nasiriya Sufi order, which was extending southward during this time from the home lodge in Tembrut, which I've marked here, at the northern end of the Sahara, right, and just south of Sijilmasa. Especially given this history of circulation, my sense is that Ibn Omar's writings stand to tell us a great deal, not just about Moroccan history, but also about material and intellectual exchange across and around the Sahara. And this is a topic I'm hoping to pursue in further future work through a critical edition of Ibn Omar's writings. But for now, I'm going to leave matters here. I really appreciate all of you listening, and I'm looking forward to questions and comments.